He knelt on the rough, splintered floorboards, the scent of damp earth and wild herbs rising to meet him. Sunlight, brilliant and unfiltered, poured through a gaping hole in the roof, illuminating not rot and decay, but life. A garden, impossible and vibrant, grew right there inside the crumbling walls of the abandoned homestead. His small shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs, tears tracing paths through the grime on his cheeks. But these were not tears of sorrow or fear, the kind he had shed for the past 3 weeks. This was something else entirely. It was the overwhelming, crushing weight of gratitude. In his arms, his infant sister, Grace, slept peacefully, her tiny chest rising and falling with a steadiness that felt like a miracle. For the first time since their father had left them to die, 11-year-old Isaiah Samuel Crane felt the icy grip of terror recede, replaced by a warmth that spread through him like the prairie sun, a profound and staggering realization that they had not been abandoned to a tomb but delivered to a sanctuary. This moment of impossible hope is the heart of the story you are about to hear, a testament to the idea that even in the most desolate of places, kindness can leave a seed that waits patiently to grow. If you believe in the power of such stories, I invite you to join our community of listeners by subscribing to the channel and leaving a like to help it reach others. We love hearing where our stories travel, so please feel free to share in the comments where you're tuning in from. I can assure you, the journey of how this young boy and his sister arrived in this sacred ruin is a journey you will want to follow until the very end, for it reveals a truth about humanity that we all need to remember. But to understand why a child's tears of relief fell upon a secret garden thriving within a broken home, we must travel back in time. We must return to the beginning of the end 3 weeks earlier, to a small family cabin on the vast Nebraska prairie. It was a place that had once been filled with warmth and his mother's song, but had since become suffocated by a grief so heavy and so silent, it felt like the world had stopped turning. The story of Isaiah's survival does not begin with the discovery of life, but in the oppressive quiet that followed a devastating loss, a silence that would ultimately force a broken man to make an unthinkable choice, and a young boy to find a strength he never knew he possessed. For 21 days, the world of 11-year-old Isaiah Samuel Crane had shrunk to the size of a single-room cabin, a space once defined by the scent of baking bread and his mother's humming, now choked by a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The Nebraska prairie outside could howl with wind or bake under the summer sun, but inside, time was measured only by the cycles of his infant sister's cries. Grief was the air he breathed, the dust motes dancing in the weak light, the cold ashes in the hearth his father no longer tended. Isaiah had learned that silence was not an absence of sound, but a presence of its own, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered every memory of laughter. He was a boy adrift in a sea of sorrow, clinging to the small, fragile raft of his sister Grace, the only living thing in the cabin that still made a sound that demanded a response. His father, Walter Crane, had become a ghost in his own home, a tall, gaunt figure who moved through the small space without purpose or recognition. He would sit for hours on a stool by the window, his gaze fixed on the endless horizon, but Isaiah knew he wasn't seeing the rolling plains or the vast sky. He was seeing a void, the shape of the woman he had lost. Walter never looked at the cradle where Grace slept or cried. His eyes would slide past it, a flicker of something unreadable, pain or perhaps resentment, crossing his features before they settled back into a mask of hollow despair. To his father, the baby was not a daughter, not a continuation of the woman he loved, but the very reason for her absence. She was a living monument to his loss, and he could not bear to look at her, nor could he look at Isaiah, whose face was a mirror of his mother's. In the face of his father's retreat from the world, Isaiah had been forced to step into a role far beyond his years. He became Grace's keeper, a solemn, terrified guardian of a life he barely understood. His hands, accustomed to whittling wood and mending fences, learned the clumsy, delicate art of changing swaddling clothes. He learned to warm water on the nearly dead embers of the fire, to mix with a little sugar, offering the soaked corner of a rag to Grace's searching mouth. It was a poor substitute for a mother, a desperate improvisation that left the baby hungry and crying, and left Isaiah feeling like a profound failure. Each wail from the cradle was a fresh accusation, a reminder of his inadequacy and the gaping hole his mother's death had torn in their lives. He was no longer a child. He was the sole, faltering pillar holding up the collapsing roof of his family. The cabin itself seemed to be grieving. The air carried a stale, sour scent of unwashed linens and the faint, ever-present smell of dust. The single glass windowpane, once clear and bright, was now filmed with grime, muting the harsh prairie light into a perpetual twilight that did little to warm the cold, packed earth floor. At night, the wind would press against the log walls, its mournful cry a lonely counterpoint to Grace's whimpers. Isaiah remembered a time when that same wind had been a comforting sound, a lullaby that meant he was safe and warm beside his parents. Now, it only served to highlight their isolation, a constant reminder that they were a tiny, forgotten island in an ocean of grass, and the tide of his father's sorrow was threatening to pull them all under. Sometimes, in the quiet moments when Grace finally slept, a memory of his mother would surface, so vivid and sharp it felt like a phantom touch. He would see her standing by the flour barrel, her arms dusted white to the elbows, a gentle smile on her face as she hummed a hymn. He could almost smell the yeast and hear the soft thud of dough on the wooden board. The memory was a sanctuary and a torment, a brief flash of warmth that only made the present coldness more unbearable. He would squeeze his eyes shut, trying to hold on to the image, but it would always fade, leaving him alone again in the dim, silent cabin with the ghost of his father and the fragile weight of his sister's life resting entirely on his small, trembling shoulders. His days fell into a grueling, repetitive rhythm, a desperate dance of survival. Grace's cry would pierce the silence, and Isaiah would be there, his heart pounding with a familiar mix of love and fear. He would lift her from the cradle, her tiny body so light it felt like holding a bird. He would clean her as best he could, his movements practiced but still uncertain. He would wrap her in a piece of their mother's faded blue shawl, the fabric still holding the faintest scent of her, a scent that was both a comfort and a fresh stab of pain. Then came the ritual of feeding, the frustrating attempt to coax a few drops of sugar water into her. He saw the way she grew weaker, the way her cries lost their strength, and a cold dread settled deep in his bones. He was caught between two impossible worlds. On one side was the overwhelming grief for his mother, a sorrow so vast he felt he could drown in it. But he had no time to drown. On the other side was the immediate, terrifying reality of his sister's needs. His own pain had to be packed away, stored in a dark corner of his heart, because Grace's survival depended on his complete attention. He felt a loneliness so absolute, it was like a physical hunger. He would look at his father, sitting motionless, and feel a desperate urge to scream, to shake him, to force him to see what was happening. But he knew it was useless. The man who had taught him how to track a deer and read the stars was gone, replaced by this silent statue of despair. A week before the end, a subtle shift occurred. Walter Crane began to move, but his movements were not those of a man returning to life. They were slow, deliberate, and detached, like someone packing away the belongings of a stranger. He gathered their mother's few possessions, her sewing kit, a worn book of poetry, the silver locket she always wore, and placed them carefully into a small wooden crate. Isaiah watched every motion, a knot of ice forming in his stomach. This was not the act of a man preparing to cherish memories. It felt like an act of erasure, a final closing of a door. He wasn't preserving his wife's legacy for her children. He was severing a tie, cutting the last threads that bound him to his past and to them. The evidence of their slow decline was most apparent in Grace herself. Her skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality, and the fontanelle on her head seemed to pulse with a fragile, fading rhythm. Her cries, which had once been robust and demanding, were now thin and reedy, petering out into exhausted whimpers. Isaiah would hold her tiny, cold hand, his thumb stroking her paper-thin skin, and feel a surge of primal terror. He was not a farmer or a doctor. He was a boy, and he was watching his sister starve. He understood with the brutal clarity of a child forced to face adult truths that his efforts were not enough. Love could not fill an empty stomach. His desperate care was merely slowing the inevitable. This new, chilling understanding sharpened his fear into a single point of certainty. There was no protector left in his world. His mother, the source of all warmth and safety, was gone, and his father, the man who was supposed to be his shield against the harshness of the world, had become a danger in his own right. His neglect was not passive, it was an active, destructive force, a tide of inaction that was pulling them under. Isaiah looked from Grace's shallow breathing to his father's vacant stare, and knew with a certainty that stole the air from his lungs that they were utterly and completely alone. The cabin was no longer a home. It had become a waiting room for a tragedy he was powerless to prevent. He spent that final night sitting on the floor beside the cradle, one hand resting on its wooden frame, rocking it with a gentle, steady motion. Grace was fitfully asleep, her small chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Across the room, his father sat in his usual spot, a dark silhouette against the moonlit window. Isaiah didn't sleep. He watched his father, an unspoken, desperate plea burning behind his eyes, a prayer that the man would turn, would speak, would see them. But Walter Crane never moved. The silence in the cabin stretched on, no longer just a symptom of grief, but a prelude. It was the deep, unnatural calm of the air just before a storm breaks, promising not relief but devastation. The oppressive silence of the cabin shattered, not with a shout, but with the scrape of a chair on the wooden floor. It happened on a Tuesday morning, just as the first pale light of dawn filtered through the grimy window. Walter Crane stood up. For 3 weeks, he had been a statue carved from grief, but now the statue was moving. His actions were slow, deliberate, and possessed a chilling purpose that made the fine hairs on Isaiah's arms stand on end. He didn't stoke the fire or fetch water. Instead, he walked to the corner, where a small, sturdy crate sat, the one he had built for their journey west years ago. He lifted the lid, and with a detached air, began to place their mother's few remaining treasures inside. Isaiah watched from his pallet on the floor, his breath caught in his throat. This was not the movement of a man rejoining the world of the living. It was the methodical, unnerving preparation of a man about to perform a final, irreversible act. The true nature of the threat was not in what his father packed, but in what he so pointedly ignored. Into the crate went the silver locket, the worn book of poetry, the small bundle of letters from her family back east. He added a single water skin, barely half full, and one thin, threadbare blanket. But he did not go to the flour sack, nor did he pack the salted pork hanging from the rafters. He left the cast-iron skillet on its hook by the hearth, and ignored the box of dried beans that could sustain them for a month. To Isaiah, who had been raised on the harsh calculus of prairie survival, these omissions were a declaration of intent louder than any spoken word. You did not venture into the Nebraska wilderness without food. You did not plan for a future without provisions. His father wasn't packing for a journey. He was packing a memorial, and the boy understood with a sudden, sickening clarity that he and his sister were not meant to be survivors of this trip. When the packing was finished, Walter turned. He didn't speak Isaiah's name. He simply gestured with his head toward the door, a cold, dismissive command. Then he did something he hadn't done since the day she was born. He walked to the cradle and picked up Grace. The action sent a wild, foolish spark of hope through Isaiah's chest, but it was extinguished in an instant. His father held the baby not like a father, but like a man carrying a burden he was about to set down. His arms were stiff, his face impassive. Isaiah scrambled to his feet, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, and followed his father out into the blinding morning light. The farm wagon was already hitched. His father placed Grace in the back, her small form wrapped in the faded blue shawl, looking lost and fragile against the rough-hewn planks, before lifting Isaiah in beside her. The journey was a long, waking nightmare that stretched across 2 full days. Walter Crane drove the wagon relentlessly eastward, away from the sparse settlements, and into the vast, unpopulated heart of the territory. He never spoke. He never looked back. The only sounds were the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels, the soft sigh of the wind through the tall grass, and the increasingly weak cries of the baby. Isaiah huddled in the back, one arm protectively around his sister, his eyes scanning the endless, rolling horizon for any sign of life, for anything other than the suffocating emptiness that mirrored the void in his father's eyes. He offered Grace the sugar rag, but her sucking was feeble, her energy fading. The prairie that had once been his home, a place of adventure and learning, had transformed into a featureless, hostile expanse, an accomplice to his father's chilling plan. With each mile they traveled, Isaiah's desperate hope that this was some grief-addled misunderstanding eroded, ground down by the relentless sun and the implacable silence from the front of the wagon. He watched the sunset, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple that felt like a mockery of their situation. He watched it rise again, a stark white disk in a pale sky. They were not heading toward anything, they were heading toward nothing. The realization settled in his bones, cold and heavy as a stone. This was not a trip to a new town or a distant relative. This was a deliberate, methodical march into oblivion. He was a prisoner on his own family's wagon, being transported to a place from which there would be no return. Late on the second day, the wagon finally lurched to a halt. Isaiah peered over the side and saw it, a derelict settler's homestead, a skeletal ruin silhouetted against the afternoon sky. It was a place of profound failure, with gaping holes where the door and windows should have been, and a section of the roof entirely caved in. The wind whistled through the broken walls, a mournful, lonely sound. There was no well, no sign of a neighboring farm, nothing but the crumbling structure and the endless sea of grass. His father climbed down from his seat, his movements still eerily calm, and walked to the back of the wagon. For a wild, senseless moment, Isaiah's mind clutched at the idea that they were simply stopping for the night, but the finality in his father's posture told him the truth. This was not a stop. This was the destination. Without a word, Walter Crane lifted Isaiah from the wagon bed and set him on his feet on the dusty, splintered floorboards inside the ruin. He then reached back in for Grace, placing the swaddled infant into Isaiah's trembling arms. He set the small crate containing their mother's things down beside them. The three of them stood there for a long moment in the decaying structure, a tableau of silent farewell. Isaiah looked up into his father's face, searching for a flicker of doubt, a hint of love, anything to prove that the man who had taught him to fish and read the stars was still in there. But the eyes that met his were empty, the eyes of a stranger looking at a task he simply needed to complete. It was then that Walter Crane spoke, his voice a dry, rasping sound like dead leaves skittering across the ground. He did not look at Isaiah, but past him, at the broken wall and the empty horizon beyond. "God looks after the innocent," he said, the words falling like stones into the heavy silence. "If he exists, he'll look after you. Because I can't." The statement was delivered without emotion, without apology. It was not a plea for forgiveness or a cry of despair. It was a sentence, a final chilling abdication of his role as a father, a severing of the last bond that held their broken family together. He was handing them over to a God he wasn't even sure he believed in, washing his hands of their existence. He turned then, without another look, and walked away. Isaiah stood frozen, the weight of his sister in his arms suddenly immense, the cruel words echoing in the hollow space. He watched his father climb back onto the wagon, take up the reins and drive away without a single backward glance. He watched until the wagon was a small dark speck against the vastness of the prairie, and then he watched until it was nothing at all, swallowed by the horizon. The sound of the wheels faded, replaced by a silence more profound and terrifying than any he had ever known, and in that silence a tiny, fretful sound began. Grace was crying, a weak, hungry whimper that cut through Isaiah's shock and landed in his heart with the force of a physical blow. The threat was no longer an abstract dread, it was immediate, tangible, and ticking. Grace needed milk, and she needed it now. They had been left to die. For a long, breathless moment after the wagon vanished, Isaiah stood as if rooted to the prairie floor, the world reduced to the vast, indifferent blue of the sky and the whisper of the wind through the tall grass. The finality of his father's departure was not a thought, but a physical sensation, a hollowing out of his chest that left him feeling weightless and terrifyingly exposed. The silence that descended was absolute, a heavy, hair-pressive blanket that smothered the fading sound of the wagon wheels and amplified the crushing scale of his isolation. He was a solitary figure in a landscape that stretched to infinity, a boy holding the fragile spark of his sister's life against the immense, uncaring wilderness. In that moment of profound stillness, the world felt ancient and empty, and the chilling reality settled not in his mind, but in his bones. They had been erased, left behind in a forgotten corner of the earth where no one would ever think to look. That suffocating paralysis was shattered by a sound. It was not a loud cry, but a thin, reedy whimper from the bundle in his arms. Grace. Her small, fretful noise cut through the vast silence of the prairie and straight into Isaiah's heart, a biological imperative that overrode his shock and fear. It was the sound of a life demanding to be lived, a ticking clock that had just begun its countdown. In that instant a decision was made, not through logic or reason, but through a primal surge of protective instinct that was as fierce as it was terrifying. He would not stand here and wait for the end. He would not surrender to the emptiness. He was no longer his father's abandoned son. He was Grace's brother, her only shield, and his body began to move before his mind had fully caught up, driven by the singular, desperate purpose of answering that small, urgent cry for life. He turned and stumbled back into the decaying homestead, his eyes frantically scanning the ruin not as a tomb, but as a potential cache of resources. His mind, a chaotic storm of fear, latched onto the lessons his mother had taught him, her voice a faint echo from a world that no longer existed. He remembered her showing him how to find water, how to identify edible plants, how to read the signs of the land. But those lessons were for a living world, for a prairie teeming with life, not this skeletal structure that smelled of dust and decay. The immediate, overwhelming need was for milk, or at least clean water to mix with the last of the sugar he had in a small pouch. He laid Grace gently in the crate his father had left, the one containing their mother's memories, and began his search, his movements clumsy and frantic, a desperate race against the sun's slow descent toward the horizon. The main room offered nothing but despair. The floor was a treacherous landscape of splintered planks and gaping holes, revealing the dark, packed earth beneath. Fine dust as soft as silt coated every surface, rising in ghostly clouds with every step he took. The air was thick with the scent of dry rot and the faint, sour smell of animal nests long abandoned. He ran his hands along the crumbling log walls, searching for a loose stone or a hidden compartment, a wild hope born of the stories his mother used to read to him. But there were no secrets here, only the stark, brutal evidence of failure. His father's parting words, "God looks after the innocent," echoed in his mind, a sentiment that felt not like a blessing but like the cruelest kind of joke, a bitter abdication thrown into the hollow emptiness of this forsaken place. He fought back the wave of hopelessness that threatened to drown him. He could not afford the luxury of grief or anger. He had to be practical. He had to be methodical. He forced himself to breathe, to think like his father had taught him before the sorrow had consumed him. He remembered his father once saying that settlers, even when they fled, often left things behind in haste, things buried beneath the floorboards or tucked away in the rafters. With renewed purpose, Isaiah began to pry at the edges of the broken planks with his bare fingers, the rough wood digging into his skin. He peered into the darkness of the crawl space, his heart pounding, half expecting to see the glint of a discarded tin or a forgotten jar, but he found only more dirt, tangled roots, and the brittle remains of insects. The homestead was not just abandoned, it had been picked clean by time and desperation. His search grew more urgent, more frenzied. He moved through the different sections of the ruin, his small frame navigating the treacherous debris with a desperate agility. He explored what might have been a kitchen, a collapsed lean-to at the back of the structure, where a rusted stovepipe lay half buried in the dirt. He dug around it with his hands, his nails filling with soil, his mind clinging to the possibility of a root cellar. He found a shard of a ceramic bowl, its blue and white pattern a ghostly reminder of a life once lived here, but it was empty, useless. Each dead end, each new discovery of nothing, chipped away at his resolve. The sun was lower now, casting long, distorted shadows that made the ruin feel even more menacing, as if the ghosts of its failed inhabitants were watching his futile efforts with silent pity. Then the sound from the crate changed. Grace's cries, which had been a steady, if weak, complaint, now subsided into a series of soft, exhausted whimpers. The change was terrifying. It was the sound of energy fading, of a tiny body beginning to shut down. The mental clock in Isaiah's head began to scream, its ticking deafeningly loud. He scrambled back to her side, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He touched her cheek. It was cool. Her eyes were closed, her small mouth opening and closing with a faint, searching motion. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his adrenaline-fueled focus. He was failing. Every second he spent searching was a second she was slipping away. The vastness of the prairie, the emptiness of the homestead, the totality of his failure crashed down on him with suffocating force. He was just a boy, and he was watching his sister starve. In that moment of absolute despair, he did the only thing he had left to do. He knelt on the dusty floor beside the crate, closed his eyes, and prayed. It was not a prayer of formal words or rehearsed verses. It was a raw, silent scream of the soul, a desperate plea flung into the immense, silent sky. He prayed to the God his father had invoked, the God his mother had loved. He prayed to his mother herself, begging her for guidance, for a sign, for a miracle. He poured all of his fear, all of his love for grace, all of his desperate, terrified hope into that silent appeal. He wasn't asking for an army or a rescue party. He was asking for a single drop of water, a mouthful of milk, a sign that they had not been utterly and completely forsaken in this desolate land. He stayed there for a long time, kneeling in the dust, the silence answering his plea. The hope that had surged through him began to recede, leaving behind the cold, hard certainty of their fate. He had done everything he could. He had searched, he had fought, he had prayed, and it wasn't enough. A profound exhaustion settled over him, a weight heavier than any physical burden. He opened his eyes and looked at his sister, her breathing now terrifyingly shallow. He was ready to give up, to simply lie down beside her and wait for the end, to let the silence take them both as it had taken his mother. He had no more ideas, no more strength. The fight was over. The prairie had won. And then he heard it. It was a faint sound, so quiet he thought at first it was the wind whistling through a crack in the log walls, or perhaps a figment of his strained imagination. A low, guttural bleat. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. He held his breath, listening, straining to hear it again over the frantic pounding of his own heart. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of the mind, a false hope his desperate brain had conjured from the empty air. The world was silent again, and he felt a fresh stab of despair, the cruelty of a hope that lasted only a second. He was about to slump back down when the sound came again, closer this time, and unmistakably real. It was the sound of an animal. That single weak bleat was a thunderclap in Isaiah's silent world. It was impossible, it was illogical, but it was real. A wild, electrifying energy surged through his exhausted body, chasing away the despair and replacing it with a hope so fierce it was painful. He didn't know what it was or where it came from, but it was life. It was a sound other than the wind and his sister's fading cries. He scrambled to his feet, his earlier exhaustion forgotten. Leaving Grace for a moment, he moved toward the back of the homestead, toward the collapsed lean-to where he had been digging just moments before. He moved with a stealth he didn't know he possessed, his heart hammering against his ribs, every sense alight. He was no longer a boy waiting to die. He was a hunter, tracking the sound of a miracle. He moved with a hunter's focus, his small body a vessel of pure, desperate instinct, pushing through the tall prairie grass that whipped and scratched at his bare arms. The sound led him toward the back of the derelict structure, to a collapsed lean-to that was now little more than a skeletal frame, choked with a dense, thorny thicket of wild plum and overgrown brush. The bleating came from somewhere inside that tangled mess, a sound of distress that was both his only hope and another problem to solve. He could see nothing through the dense wall of leaves and thorns, a natural barrier that seemed designed to keep him from his goal. The air was thick with the scent of crushed wild mint and dry earth, and the only other sound was the frantic, ragged whisper of his own breathing, a stark counterpoint to the animal's plaintive cry. Every nerve in his body was screaming at him to hurry, but some deeper, calmer part of him, a part that sounded like his mother's voice, knew that reckless haste would only lead to failure. The thicket was a formidable obstacle, a woven fortress of sharp branches and clinging vines that tore at his thin cotton shirt and snagged on his trousers. For a moment he considered trying to go around, but the lean-to's remaining structure was unstable, and the sound was coming from the very heart of the growth. There was no other way. He had to go through. Lowering his shoulder, he pushed into the abrasive wall of vegetation, shielding his face with one arm as thorns raked across his skin, leaving thin red lines in their wake. It was a slow, painful battle, a fight for every inch. He could hear the animal inside thrashing, its bleats growing more frantic as he drew closer, and the sound spurred him onward, ignoring the stinging cuts and the sharp snag of branches that tried to hold him back. He was no longer thinking, only moving, driven by the singular, overwhelming need to reach the source of that sound, the impossible promise of life. Finally, with one last, desperate shove, he broke through the last of the branches and stumbled into a small shadowed clearing within the ruin of the lean-to. And there she was, a nanny goat, her coat the color of dusty straw, her ribs showing starkly beneath her hide. She was painfully thin, but her eyes were bright with a wild, frightened intelligence, and most importantly, her udder was full and taut. A frayed piece of rope was cinched tightly around her neck, its other end hopelessly tangled in the V-shaped fork of a thick, dead branch, trapping her. She strained against the rope, her breath coming in panicked pants, her small hooves churning the dirt. In that instant, Isaiah's world, which had been a maelstrom of fear and despair, suddenly contracted to this single miraculous point. A living, breathing source of milk, a divine answer to a prayer he hadn't even known how to properly form. A wave of elation threatened to make him careless, but he fought it down, forcing a stillness upon his trembling body. He knew from his life on the farm that a frightened animal was an unpredictable one. If he rushed forward, she might bolt, strangling herself on the rope or breaking a leg in the process. The miracle could be snatched away as quickly as it had been given. He remembered his mother, her calm, steady presence around the livestock, the low, humming tune she would use to soothe a nervous cow. He took a slow, deliberate breath, trying to push the frantic urgency from his heart, and began to speak to the goat. His voice was a low, wavering whisper, not forming real words, just soft murmuring sounds meant to convey safety, meant to tell this terrified creature that he was not a threat, but a rescuer. He took one slow step forward, then another, his movements measured and careful. As he drew closer, he could see the true nature of her predicament, and a fresh knot of ice formed in his stomach. The rope wasn't just tangled. It was wedged deep into the fork of the branch, pulled so taut by the goat struggling that it was cutting into the wood. Every time she pulled, the rope tightened, choking her. He couldn't simply untangle it. It was too tight, the knot too complex and buried. His mind raced, cataloguing his limited options. He needed to cut the rope or break the branch. He had no knife. He was just a boy with two empty hands, and the branch was as thick as his wrist. The problem had shifted from finding the source of life to freeing it, a task that suddenly seemed just as monumental and impossible as finding water in a desert. The goat watched him, her dark eyes wide with terror, her sides heaving. His first instinct was to use brute force. He grabbed the branch with both hands and pulled, throwing all of his meager weight into the effort. The wood was old and dry, but it was unyielding, refusing to crack, sending a jarring shock up his arms. He tried again, grunting with exertion, his face flushing with the strain. Nothing. A surge of desperate frustration washed over him, hot and sharp. He was so close. The solution was right here, inches from his grasp, but his own physical weakness was the barrier. He felt a childish urge to scream, to beat his fists against the unmoving wood, but he choked it back. Grace did not have time for his anger. He scanned the ground around him, his eyes darting over the rubble and debris, searching for anything that could serve as a tool. His gaze fell upon a heavy, jagged piece of fieldstone, its edge sharpened by a clean break. It wasn't a knife, but it was something. He snatched up the rock, its weight a solid, reassuring presence in his hand, and returned to the trapped goat. "It's all right," he whispered, his voice still shaky. "I'll get you out." He began to work on the branch, not with the brute force of his hands, but with the focused percussion of the stone. He used the sharp edge to saw and scrape at the wood, then turned it and used its weight to hammer at the scored line. The work was slow, grueling, and agonizingly loud. Each dull thud of rock against wood made the goat jump, her eyes rolling in fear. Saw, strike, saw, strike. Splinters flew and a fine powder of dry wood dusted his hands. His arms began to ache, a deep burn settling into his shoulders. But he didn't stop. He was fueled by the image of Grace's still face, the memory of her weakening cries. A crack appeared in the wood. He redoubled his efforts, and with a final, splintering snap, the branch broke. The sudden release sent the goat stumbling forward, the broken piece of rope now trailing from her neck. For a heart-stopping second, Isaiah was certain she would bolt, disappearing back into the prairie, taking his hope with her. He froze, the rock still clutched in his hand, his breath held tight in his chest. But the goat, perhaps too exhausted or too shocked to run, simply took a few steps and stopped, turning to look at him with a startlingly intelligent gaze. She was free, but she hadn't fled. She stood her ground, shivering slightly, her fear now tempered with a clear sense of curiosity. Isaiah let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, a ragged gasp of relief. He had passed the first test. He had freed her. He had not lost his miracle. Now came the next, even more critical step. He needed to get the milk. He slowly set the rock down and held out an empty hand, palm up, continuing to make his soft, soothing sounds. The goat watched him, her ears twitching, but she allowed him to take another step closer, and then another. He was almost beside her when a devastating realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had nothing to milk her into. The water skin his father had left was small, with a narrow opening completely unsuitable for the task. His cupped hands would leak more than they held. The thought was so crushing it nearly buckled his knees. He had come this far, overcome every obstacle, only to be defeated by the lack of a simple bowl. The absurdity of it, the sheer cruel irony, brought a fresh wave of despair that was almost worse than the initial abandonment. He stood there, his mind a blank wall of panic, the goat watching him patiently. Then, through the fog of his despair, a memory surfaced, a fleeting image from his frantic, earlier search inside the homestead. He had been digging near the collapsed chimney of the lean-to, searching for a root cellar, and his fingers had brushed against something smooth and hard. He had seen it for a fraction of a second, a piece of a ceramic bowl, its blue and white pattern stark against the dark soil. At the time he had dismissed it as useless junk, another piece of the ruin's long history of failure. But now that broken shard was not a symbol of failure, it was a vessel of salvation. A half bowl, a broken piece of a life long gone, was infinitely better than nothing. It was enough. It had to be. With a renewed sense of purpose, he backed away from the goat slowly, never taking his eyes off her, his heart pounding with the fear that she would finally run. He moved to the pile of rubble where the chimney had once stood and began to dig with his bare hands, his fingers, already raw from prying at floorboards, scraping against dirt and stone. He worked with a feverish intensity, his mind chanting a single, silent prayer. Please be there, please be there. His fingers closed around the smooth, curved edge of the ceramic. He pulled it free. It was a large shard, the bottom half of a thick, sturdy bowl, deep enough to hold a precious few mouthfuls of milk. It was a tangible piece of hope, a gift from the homestead's forgotten past. His momentary triumph was immediately tempered by a new problem. The shard was caked with years of packed-in dirt and grime, a fine, dark silt that clung to its surface. He couldn't give Grace milk contaminated with filth. She was too weak, and the sickness would surely kill her faster than the hunger. He had no water to wash it, not a single clean drop. His mind, now sharpened by necessity, found a desperate, imperfect solution. He took the hem of his own shirt, the cleanest part that was left, and began to scrub at the inside of the bowl. He rubbed and polished with a fierce determination, scraping away the dirt with his fingernail, wiping and wiping until the inner surface was as clean as he could possibly make it. It was still stained and dull, but it was free of loose dirt. It would have to do. He returned to the goat, his movements slow and reverent, the broken bowl held in his hands like a sacred chalice. To his profound relief, she was still there, calmly stripping the leaves from a low-hanging branch. It was as if she understood, as if she had been waiting for him. This was a moment of pure, unadulterated luck, a grace note in his symphony of desperation. He knelt in the dirt beside her, his body moving with a liquid slowness, every muscle tense to avoid startling her. He could feel the warmth radiating from her thin body, could smell the dusty animal scent of her hide. She turned her head and looked at him, and in her dark eyes he saw not fear but a kind of weary acceptance. He reached out a trembling hand and gently touched her side. She didn't flinch. Now came the part he had only ever watched his mother do. His hands felt clumsy and foreign as he positioned the bowl and reached for her taut udder. His first attempts were a dismal failure. His grip was wrong, his motions too jerky. A thin stream of milk sprayed uselessly onto the dirt, and another shot sideways, hitting his own arm. Panic fluttered in his chest. He was spilling it. He was wasting the very life he was trying to save. He closed his eyes for a second, picturing his mother's hands, their confident, rhythmic motion. He took a deep breath, adjusted his grip, and tried again, pulling down with a steady, even pressure. This time it worked. A thick, white stream of milk shot directly into the bowl, making a soft, drumming sound against the ceramic. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He didn't take much, just enough to fill the shallow bowl about halfway. He knew the goat was weak and probably dehydrated herself, and he needed her to survive as much as he needed her milk. He had to think about tomorrow and the day after that. As he worked, a name for her formed in his mind, a word his mother had often used when speaking of a timely rain or a good harvest. Providence. It felt right. She was not just a goat. She was a provision, a living, breathing act of a grace he was only just beginning to comprehend. When he had his precious prize, he backed away slowly. Providence, seemingly unbothered, immediately lowered her head and began to nibble at a patch of clover, as if her part in the day's drama was concluded. The journey back to the main room of the homestead was the most perilous trip of his life. He carried the shallow, open-topped bowl with both hands, his eyes locked on the surface of the milk, which sloshed dangerously with every tiny movement. He walked with a painstaking slowness, his bare feet carefully testing each splintered floorboard before he put his weight down. He was a tightrope walker, and the precious liquid was his balance, his entire world. A single stumble, a single misplaced step, and it would all be for nothing. The dust motes dancing in the shafts of afternoon light seemed to mock his slow progress, and the silence of the ruin felt heavier than ever, pregnant with the possibility of failure even at this final stage. He reached the wooden crate where he had left his sister. She was terrifyingly still. Her whimpers had faded away completely, and for one heart-stopping moment, he thought he was too late. He knelt beside her, his hands shaking so violently that the milk trembled on the verge of spilling. He set the bowl down with infinite care on the dusty floor, his own breath catching in his throat. He had done it. He had found the goat, freed her, procured a vessel, and transported the milk without losing a drop. He had fought his way through a dozen different kinds of failure, and now he had arrived at the moment that would determine if any of it had mattered at all. The entire universe had shrunk to this single, desperate act of feeding. Gently, he dipped his forefinger into the still warm milk. It felt rich and alive against his skin. He brought the dripping finger to grace his lips, his heart a painful, throbbing drum in the silent room. At first there was no response. He touched her lips again, a silent, desperate plea. Then he felt it, a flicker of movement. Her mouth, which had been slack and pale, began to work, a tiny, searching motion. He touched her lips again, and this time she responded. Her mouth closed around the tip of his finger, and she began to suckle, a weak but determined pull that sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated relief through Isaiah's entire body. It was a sensation so powerful, so overwhelming, it felt like the sun breaking through a storm cloud directly inside his chest. She was drinking, she was fighting, she was alive. With Grace finally quiet, her small body surrendered to a deep, milk-fed sleep. A profound stillness settled over Isaiah for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The frantic, screaming urgency that had been his constant companion for weeks receded, leaving behind a vast, quiet space in his mind. He watched the steady rise and fall of her chest, a simple, beautiful rhythm that was the only proof he needed that the world had not ended. The ruin, which had seemed a tomb just an hour ago, now felt different. The wind whistling through the broken walls no longer sounded like a mournful cry, but like a quiet sigh of relief. He was still alone, still a boy in a desolate wilderness, but he had survived the first test. He had found a way. This small temporary victory felt monumental, a single flickering candle lit against an infinite darkness, and it was just enough light to see the path to the next step. Fueled by this fragile new hope, he laid Grace gently back inside the wooden crate, tucking the worn blue shawl more snugly around her. Her survival for the next few hours was secured, but Isaiah knew that was not enough. His mind, now clear of the immediate panic, began to work with a new kind of purpose. He needed to understand this place, not as a grave, but as a shelter. He needed to assess its strengths and weaknesses to find its secrets. He was no longer just a victim of his father's despair. He was the sole guardian of this small, fragile life, and that responsibility transformed him. He began to move through the homestead again, but this time his search was not a frantic, desperate scramble. It was a slow, methodical exploration, the careful inventory of a settler claiming a new, albeit broken, piece of land for his own. He made his way toward the back of the structure, to the largest room that lay beyond the main living space. This area had suffered the most damage. A massive section of the sod roof had collapsed entirely, leaving a gaping, jagged hole open to the sky. He expected to find a chaotic pile of rubble, a mess of rotted timbers and crumbling earth. But as he drew closer, the air changed. The dry, dusty scent of decay that permeated the rest of the ruin gave way to something else entirely, something rich and unexpected. It was the smell of damp soil after a spring rain, the clean green scent of crushed leaves and wild herbs. It was the smell of life, a fragrance so out of place in this desolate structure that it made him stop in his tracks, his heart beginning to beat a little faster, with a cautious, uncertain curiosity. He stepped across the threshold into the room, and his bare feet met not the splintered, treacherous surface of rotting floorboards, but something soft, cool, and yielding. He looked down and his mind struggled to reconcile what his eyes were seeing. The floor was gone. In its place was a thick, vibrant carpet of green, a swath of plant life growing in a bed of dark, rich earth. It wasn't just a few stubborn weeds poking through the cracks. It was a garden, dense and thriving, contained entirely within the crumbling log walls of the house. Sunlight, brilliant and unfiltered, poured through the hole in the roof, illuminating the space with a warm, golden light. It was an impossible, secret world, a pocket of defiant life flourishing in the very heart of decay, and for a long moment Isaiah could only stand and stare, his mind utterly blank with astonishment. Then understanding dawned with the sudden, shocking clarity of a lightning strike. He looked from the lush growth on the floor to the gaping hole in the roof and saw the perfect, accidental logic of it all. The very thing that marked the homestead as a ruin, the brokenness that his father had surely seen as a sign of its failure, was the source of this miracle. For years, rain had fallen directly onto this patch of earth, and the sun had poured down its life-giving light, while the surrounding walls provided shelter from the relentless prairie winds. The homestead's collapse had inadvertently created a perfect greenhouse, a sheltered, irrigated sanctuary, where life could not only survive, but thrive. It was a breathtaking piece of natural engineering, a testament to the idea that even from the most profound destruction, something new and beautiful could grow. His gaze dropped back to the plants, and a shiver of recognition ran through him. His mother's voice whispered in his memory, her patient lessons from their own small garden echoing across the silence. He saw the feathery, bright green fronds of fennel and knew it was used to soothe an infant's colic. He saw the delicate, daisy-like flowers of chamomile, the very plant his mother would steep into a tea to help him sleep when he was restless. In a shaded corner, a small but robust bush was covered in the dark, purplish-black clusters of elderberries, the remedy she relied on to fight off fevers and coughs. It was not just a random collection of wild plants. It was a living apothecary, a complete pharmacy of remedies tailored specifically to the needs of a small child, growing right at his feet. The full weight of the discovery descended upon him, a force so powerful it almost buckled his knees. The goat, Providence, had been a miracle of sustenance, an answer to the immediate, desperate need for food. But this was a miracle of protection. This was the answer to all the fears that lay beyond immediate starvation, the fevers, the sicknesses, the sleepless nights of a suffering infant. It was a promise not just of survival for the next day, but of a future. It was a profound and specific act of grace, a provision so perfectly suited to his needs that it felt less like a coincidence and more like a carefully laid plan, a gift left by a knowing and benevolent hand that had anticipated his arrival. He knelt. The movement was involuntary, a natural response to the overwhelming sense of reverence that filled him. He knelt on the rough, splintered floorboards at the edge of the impossible garden, the scent of damp earth and wild herbs rising to meet him. The brilliant sunlight pouring through the roof illuminated the scene, catching the dust motes that danced in the air and turning them into golden sparks. In his arms, his infant sister Grace slept peacefully, her tiny chest rising and falling with a steadiness that felt like its own miracle. He looked from her sleeping face to the vibrant life growing from the dirt floor and the wall he had built inside himself to hold back his fear and his sorrow finally completely shattered. The sobs came then, shaking his small shoulders with a silent, racking force. Tears traced clean paths through the grime on his cheeks, falling onto the dark soil of the garden. But these were not the tears of sorrow or fear that he had shed for the past 3 weeks. This was something else entirely. It was the overwhelming, crushing weight of gratitude. It was the staggering realization that they had not been abandoned to a tomb, but delivered to a sanctuary. His father had seen a ruin, a place of endings. But Isaiah now saw the truth. What looked like destruction was simply the world making room for a miracle to grow. They were not forsaken. They were safe. The days that followed the discovery of the garden settled into a rhythm of survival that felt both miraculous and precarious. Each morning, Isaiah would milk Providence, her quiet presence a warm, living anchor in his desolate world. He would feed Grace, her suckling now strong and sure, and then tend to the secret garden, learning its textures and scents as his mother had once taught him. He crushed fennel seeds with a smooth stone to make a soothing water for Grace's fussy moments, and steeped chamomile flowers for her to drink from the corner of a clean rag. The homestead was no longer a tomb. It was a fortress, a self-contained world of sustenance and healing. Yet a question lingered in the quiet moments, a deep, unsettling wonder. He understood the science of the broken roof creating a greenhouse, but the sheer perfect intentionality of the plants felt like something more than a lucky accident. It felt like a whispered secret he had not yet fully understood. A purpose to this place that was still waiting to be revealed. His deeper investigation began not with a plan, but with a simple, practical need. He was trying to secure the main room against the cold prairie nights, stuffing gaps in the log walls with dried grass and mud. As he worked near the edge of the indoor garden, his foot pressed down on a floorboard that gave way with a soft, groaning sound. It was different from the others, which were either firmly in place or completely rotted through. This one was loose, cut with a precision that stood out against the ruin's decay. Curiosity, a feeling he hadn't had the luxury to indulge in weeks, sparked within him. He knelt down, his fingers tracing the straight, clean edge of the plank. It had been intentionally cut. It was not a product of time or neglect. It was a door, a hidden lid, and his heart began a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. This was something else. This was a secret. With his bare hands, he worked at the edges of the board, his fingers raw and splintered, but he barely noticed the pain. The wood was swollen with years of dampness and fit snugly in its place, refusing to yield. He retrieved the heavy fieldstone he had used to free Providence, now his only real tool, and used its edge to carefully pry at the seam. The wood groaned in protest, then with a final sharp crack of resistance it lifted free. Isaiah peered into the dark, shallow space beneath. It was not a cellar or a stash of food. It was a small, dry hollow, lined with what looked like dried leaves and moss to ward off moisture. And nestled in the center of this carefully constructed nest was a small rectangular object wrapped tightly in dark, oiled skin and bound with a leather thong. It was a package deliberately hidden and perfectly preserved from the ravages of time. He lifted it out with trembling hands. The oilskin was cool and smooth to the touch, its surface supple despite its obvious age. It had weight, a solid, promising density that spoke of something more than just paper. He sat back on his heels, the package resting in his lap, a tangible link to the people who had lived and failed in this very spot. For a moment, he hesitated, a strange sense of reverence holding him back. This was not his. It was a piece of someone else's life, a story he had no right to interrupt. But then he looked at Grace, sleeping peacefully in the crate, and at the garden that was keeping her alive, and he knew. He was a part of this place's story now. He had to understand. With a deep breath, he untied the leather thong and began to carefully unwrap the layers of oilskin, the crinkling sound loud in the silent room. Inside, protected from the damp and the dust, was a small, leather-bound journal. The cover was worn smooth at the edges, the color of rich, dark earth, and the pages were held together by a simple, sturdy stitch. It smelled of old paper, of wood smoke, and faintly of the dried herbs it had been buried with. It felt intensely personal, a sacred object he was almost afraid to open. He ran his thumb over the cover, feeling the indentations of a life he couldn't imagine. This was the heart of the homestead, the missing piece that explained the goat and the garden. This was the answer. He opened the cover, and on the first page, in a neat, elegant script that flowed across the yellowed paper, were the words that began to change everything. The Vance Homestead, Custer County, Nebraska, May 1875. My name is Elara Vance, and we have finally come home. He read on, his breath caught in his throat, devouring the words of a woman who had lived and breathed in this very space more than a decade before he was born. Elara Vance was a midwife, an herbalist, a woman of faith who had come to the prairie with her husband Jacob to build a life from the unforgiving sod. She wrote of the harsh winds and the back-breaking work, but her words were filled not with complaint, but with a profound love for the land and a deep, abiding sense of purpose. Isaiah felt a shock of recognition so powerful it was like a physical blow. This woman, with her knowledge of plants and her quiet faith, was a reflection of his own mother. He could almost hear her voice in Elara's gentle, steady prose, a connection across time that felt both impossible and undeniably real. Then he found the entry he had been searching for, though he hadn't known it. September 1876, she had written. Jacob has finished the roof on the back room, but I have asked him to leave a section open to the sky for now. It is my tithe, my offering to this land that gives so much. I have planted a healing garden, a place of remedies for the trials of this life. She went on to list the plants, and Isaiah's eyes widened as he read. Fennel for the bellies of babes who cannot speak of their pain. Chamomile to soothe a fretful child and grant a weary mother some peace. And elderberry, the prairie's own dark jewel, to fight the fevers that come with the winter winds. It was not an accident, it was a prescription. It was a prayer planted in the earth. The journal nearly fell from his numb fingers. He looked from the elegant script to the thriving green plants just a few feet away. This was not a coincidence. This was not luck. This was a deliberate act of kindness, a gift prepared by a stranger 10 years in the past. Elara Vance had not just planted a garden for herself, she had planted it for him. She had anticipated his need, his sister's colic, the fevers that might come. She had seen a future beyond her own and had left a provision for it. The thought was so overwhelming, so staggering in its generosity, that he couldn't process it. He had felt utterly alone, abandoned by the only family he had left. But the truth was, he had never been alone here. A guardian he had never met had been waiting for him all along. He forced himself to keep reading, his vision blurred by the tears that now began to well in his eyes. He learned of her husband Jacob's death from a sudden sickness in the winter of 1881, and of her own profound grief, a sorrow that mirrored his father's. But her response had not been to abandon hope. Her final entry, dated 1882, was a farewell. "I must leave this place now," she wrote. "My heart is buried here with him, and I must go back east to my people, but I will not destroy the garden. It is my belief that God wastes nothing, not even a broken home. I leave it in His hands. Perhaps one day another soul in need will find this place, and it will be for them what it was for me. A sanctuary. The journal ended there. The story stopped, but for Isaiah, it had just begun. The full, crushing weight of this revelation descended upon him. He was not a trespasser in a stranger's ruin. He was the lost soul she had written about. He and Grace were the answer to Ilara Vance's decade-old prayer. She had faced a loss as deep as his father's, but had chosen to plant a seed of hope, while his own father had chosen to plant his children in a tomb. The contrast was a blade that cut deep into his heart, carving out the last of his resentment and filling the space with a gratitude so immense it was a physical pain in his chest. He was the inheritor of a legacy of kindness, the recipient of a faith that had patiently waited in the dark earth for 10 years, waiting for the precise moment it was needed most. He closed the journal and held it to his chest, the worn leather a warm, solid presence against his thin shirt. The tears he had shed in this room before had been tears of relief, of gratitude for the simple fact of survival. But these tears were different. They were for Ilara Vance, for her loss and for her incredible, selfless gift. They were for the profound, staggering beauty of a human connection that could span a decade of silence and solitude to deliver a miracle. He was not an orphan abandoned by God and man. He was Ilara's child, her charge, the reason her garden had been waiting. And in that moment, kneeling on the floor of a broken house, he finally understood. He had not been left to die. He had been led home. The 2 years that followed were a testament to the quiet, enduring power of Ilara Vance's legacy. The Vance homestead, once a symbol of abandonment, became a world unto itself, a thriving ecosystem of survival and hope. Providence the goat provided milk for Grace, and in time she bore kids, creating a small bleating herd that became Isaiah's responsibility and his companions. The garden flourished under his careful tending, providing every remedy and comfort his growing sister needed. Isaiah learned the rhythms of the seasons, the language of the prairie, and the deep, quiet strength that comes from being utterly responsible for another human life. They were not just surviving, they were living. 2 small figures carving out an existence in a sanctuary that had been waiting for them all along. Their days measured not by loss, but by the steady, miraculous beat of their own hearts. Their discovery came in the summer of 1889, not by a searching party, but by a lone rider drawn by faint, persistent rumors of a boy healer who lived in the old Vance ruin. Dr. Nathaniel Whitmore was an itinerant doctor, a man whose own life had been hollowed out by the loss of his wife and young son to diphtheria. He approached the homestead with a weary skepticism, but what he found inside shattered his grief-worn cynicism. He saw not a feral child, but a competent, solemn boy caring for a healthy, bright-eyed toddler, surrounded by a thriving garden and a small herd of goats. He saw a miracle of resilience, and in the faces of these 2 lost children, he saw an echo of the family he had lost, a chance to fill the void that had consumed him. Dr. Whitmore brought the children back to the small town of Broken Bow, and with his arrival came the rest of their story. A quiet investigation revealed the tragic end of their father. Walter Crane had taken a room in an Omaha hotel just 2 weeks after leaving his children on the prairie, and there he had taken his own life, a final surrender to the grief he could no longer bear. For Isaiah, the news was not a shock, but a quiet, somber closing of a painful chapter. There was no anger left, only a profound pity for a man so broken he could not see the hope standing right in front of him. With no other family to claim them, Dr. Whitmore, seeing a reflection of his own second chance, officially adopted Isaiah and Grace, giving them not just a home, but a future. Under the doctor's gentle and patient mentorship, Isaiah's life transformed. The boy who had learned to survive by instinct was now given the tools of knowledge. The practical herbalism taught by his mother and Ilara's journal was now supplemented by the formal science of medicine. Dr. Whitmore saw in Isaiah not just a survivor, but a natural healer, a young man with a deep innate empathy born from his own trial by fire. He nurtured that gift, guiding Isaiah through years of study, watching with pride as the quiet, resilient boy grew into a determined and brilliant young man. A new purpose took root in Isaiah's soul, a quiet vow to honor the two women, one living and one long past, who had saved him, his mother and Ilara Vance. At the age of 26, Isaiah Samuel Crane graduated from the University of Nebraska as a physician. He could have chosen a prosperous life in a bustling city, but his path was already set. He returned to Custer County, to the very land that had almost claimed him, and used a small inheritance from Dr. Whitmore to open a free clinic dedicated to the care of women and children. His head nurse was his sister Grace, now a strong, compassionate young woman who carried no memory of their ordeal, only the unwavering love of the brother who had saved her. He was determined that in his corner of the world, no mother would die for lack of care, and no child would ever be left to face the world alone. Isaiah never tore down the old Vance homestead. It remained standing, a silent, weathered monument on the vast prairie, the garden within still tended and wild. He would visit it sometimes, standing in the room where a broken roof had let in the light, feeling the enduring presence of the woman who had planted a seed of hope in the darkness. He had learned the most profound lesson of his life within those crumbling walls, a truth he carried with him every single day. He had learned that sometimes the things that look like destruction, the moments of utter ruin and collapse, are not an ending. Sometimes they are simply the world, or perhaps God, making room for a miracle to grow.